So Bernard, thank you very much for being with us. Very exciting to listen to you and your experience. And I would prefer you to introduce yourself for those that don't know about your background and yourself. And it's all in your hands. As usual, the only question, would you prefer to be interrupted or shall we take questions by the end?
I think questions at the end would be better because I think otherwise we risk that we won't make it to the end.
That is true.
All right, okay.
There might be some things where, well, I'll point some out where we can have a look at discussions later.
Okay, so it's all in your hands.
Okay, thanks a lot. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this little presentation here and the conversation that will certainly follow. I also see from the backgrounds, which are bookshelves, which don't seem to be artificial backgrounds, that this is a particular audience that we are talking to here. And yeah, I'm delighted to looking forward to the conversations that we'll have after my talk. So yeah, maybe a few words about myself. There's actually something that I need to point out because it also frames a bit the presentations that I'm going to have. I have an academic background, but this academic background might not be typical for what you usually hear. And also I've left academia a long time ago, was somewhere in 2002, I think. And I have a PhD in historical anthropology. And during my studies, I've also done quite a bit of theory of knowledge. And so, but it's concentrated on the humanities. So it's not science, but the humanities. I think that might be interesting when you look at what are perspectives on complexity that one can take. What I've done since is, after some time working in HR, I've joined a management consultant company, which was Management Centrum St. Gallen, so Fred and Malik's company. And that's where I met the legacy of Stafford Beer. I didn't have the chance to meet him in person. It was too late. But of course, you know, a lot of work, this integration, working with the Bible system model and so on, has been part of what we've done there. And this has been my access to Stafford's work. Since 2012, I have my own company. I work mostly in networks, and what I'm trying to focus on when clients don't want me to do other things is really how does leadership and the shaping of organizations work when things are even more complex and dynamic than people think when we think like, yeah, we know what systems are and now let's just get some 200 additional variables into our model and then we can predict the behavior of the system. What if that doesn't work, and what other paths can you take? Yeah, that's kind of the context. What I want to present, what maybe also might be interesting for that context, especially for this audience, I like to create things, approaches, tools, things that leaders can use, because mostly what I do is training, coaching, and consulting. And at the same time, I also like to do them in a playful way. So, for example, on my webpage, palladio.net, you will find a little game. It's called Enigma, and you will recognize that this is a simplified version of Heinz von Förster's non-trivial machine. So the thing where he said this is impossible to solve, actually with 3 buttons and 3 outcomes, it becomes interesting. And usually people and groups of people take about half an hour and a lot of frustration, but they are able to solve it. And it's interesting to reflect on how you have to change your approaches when you go in that direction. And I just remembered that Stafford Beer has also played around with this idea of black box and, Ashley's machine. They're all variations of this. So on the webpage, you have a little computer game where you can play that. What I'm also doing is I'm trying out completely different approaches to how to help leaders. One is, for example, I write fairy tales for leaders. That book, The Leader's Fairy Tales, is going to come out this autumn. Another thing that I'm working on at the moment that's actually taken quite a bit of my time is I have already built an app for peer consultation on leadership. And I think which is quite different from what you usually see as apps, because mostly apps, with artificial intelligence and so on, they try to use behavioral psychology, behavioral economics in the approach towards individual users. And I come from a systemic angle. So I don't try to use or address individual users. I try to foster a network of users and see how I can augment the power of the network in certain ways through an app. Yeah, so much about myself. What am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about an element which I believe is often a bit neglected. Maybe you will have another opinion on that, but often when I see people or hear people write and talk about the Bible system model, I have the impression sometimes we are talking only about one part, and we are not looking about a certain connection to what is sometimes partly included in the Bible system model, but also sometimes just beyond the horizon of what is in focus. I'm talking about the squiggly lines. And I want to show how in practice, what means can you have to influence that last mile of behavior when structure is no longer the right choice, the right instrument. That's what we're going to look at, and we're going to have some examples from companies at the end, and also some translation into really tools or instruments that practitioners can use. But let's start with something a bit more theoretical, maybe. And as I said, I come from academia, but I've left it, so I can show you maybe not the most recent things, but I want to show you something nonetheless, because maybe some of you have not had that past in the humanities, which, however, connects quite strongly. And what I want to show here is a debate that has gone on, or a way of dividing, especially views on society. So we're talking about sociology for quite a long time, and that is that structure can be in the focus of how you build your theory of society, or individual behavior. The situation with an individual behavior in that situation can be the core of that. And at the time that I was studying these things, the two people who were kind of the exponents of this debate were Niklas Luhmann and Jürgen Habermas. So Jürgen Habermas, behavior, and Luhmann, structure. But you can go back in history. You can say, like, Durkheim, for example, was like 100 years earlier was more structure oriented. A.B. Warburg was more behavior oriented. People like Adorno and Horkheimer were more structure oriented. Erving Goffman was more behavior oriented. Claude Lévi-Strauss was as an ethnological approach or an anthropological approach was more structure oriented. Clifford Geertz was more behavior oriented. The list would go on and on and on. So we can really see kind of, okay, what is the core point of view that we are taking when we try to build our theory of understanding society better? And in the time that I was at university, there was kind of the fashion that there was this first time that somebody really managed to unite the two, and that was Pierre Bourdieu with his concept of the habitus. That was both the core of a behavior-oriented theoretical argument and a structure-oriented theoretical argument. Now, when you take that out of sociology and look at the organization, you can say that both structure and behavior are ways to influence execution, if you want, to influence performance in an organization. I like to use metaphors. That's why I'm not showing you people and organizations here. But the metaphors, like how when you take sheep, and this metaphor is maybe with a little tongue in cheek, because if you look at the reality of organizations today, you will find often that for a reason that no individual has actually devised and decided to take, the result is that you produce sheeple. You produce a kind of not really thinking behavior and not really responsible, no ownership and so on in organizations. You produce this typical passive bureaucratic execution. Why? What is happening here? And but my focus here is more kind of what is the part that structure can influence, and what is a part where structure is no longer the right choice, and where behavior, leadership, or the behavior of colleagues is actually the way to influence the desired behavior. And especially you can also connect that to the theory of incomplete contracts. What is a part where really we are getting to an end of the tools and instruments of structures? Now, how does this connect to the Bible system model? Well, I have collected some depictions of the valuable system models, and I guess they're all highly debatable. Just from the internet, I've made a Google search, image search, and collected some of the pictures. I want to show them to you, and maybe to ask you a little bit to check what you find as a commonality of all these representations. So let's have a look at this one, for example. So here we have, you know, more or less all the elements and some descriptions you might argue about. Let's go on to the next one. It's another one. There's another one. Again, a different one, here only the operational part. That's a German one, okay. But if you look at just at the pictures, what happens here? I think, is that all? No, there is another one still. Any guesses? What do they have in common? Let me just check. Oh, yeah, still another one. Sorry for the quality here. Yeah, that was it. I'm going back here. Who has a guess? What do they all have in common?
No squiggly lines.
Exactly. They all miss the squiggly lines. Some of them are actually tougher, like this one. They completely miss also overlaps in the environment, which I think are very important when you want to reason find a rationale for the existence of squiggly line. If you don't point out to overlaps in the relevant environments of the various systems one, how can you get there? Here you have sub environments, but you don't have overlaps between them. Here again, no overlaps, but anyway, always no squiggly lines. Exactly. So what are the squiggly lines? And I want maybe to show you a little. I haven't browsed through all the books of Stafford here. I've taken Heart of the Enterprise, and here are some quotations that I found there. So one is that the squiggly lines are a postulated connection between operations. That may be kind of the shortest form of a definition. I think what's more important, you can see them here on the right, they are direct connections between the operation of systems one. And of course, what's more important, if you find out, yes, by that they can absorb a certain element of variety that comes from the fact that their relevant environments of each system one have overlaps. So maybe the several system ones deal with the same customer, or maybe they deal with the same region, or they deal with people or whatever who have connections to each other. So to deal with these overlaps, some of it is dealt with directly between the operations. And in the meantime, I'm sure you have read these other two quotations. I'm not going to read them to you. But what I find interesting here is that Stafford points out that the importance of these squiggly lines is that certain things happen very informally, but also quickly, on the spot, contextually, related to the situation. And an invitation for later, that was the reason why I said let's not have the discussion here. An invitation for later, maybe it's interesting also to discuss about what is then the difference between coordination happening in the squiggly lines and coordination happening between the different managements of the systems one. One of the strengths that I have in using the viable system model, one of the strengths that I constantly see and put to the foreground in difference to other kinds of talking about organization, is that it focuses on function. It doesn't focus on jobs or hierarchies or something like that. It focuses on what needs to happen in order to make the operations work. And if you only talk like that, then, if I give you the example, if we have one of these these hotels, these resorts with different bungalows, and we have John, who is the guy who has to carry the people's luggage to the bungalows, and he's on his way with his luggage to bungalow number 37 far away, and he sees the gardener, another system one, who comes here on with his electric car, and he shouts out "Oi!" and stops the car in order to put his luggages on there. He's doing coordination work. I would say that's squiggly lines. But at the same time, maybe you could also argue, well, that's John changing hats, and he has now a management hat on, because what he does is he doesn't execute his job of carrying the luggage. He does a coordination job. He slows down the execution of the gardening work in order to save resources on his luggage carrying. So what's the difference between something that's happening in the squiggly lines and something that's happening in the system, in the management exchange between the different systems one, or actually in the systems two? Let's take this on through the different examples that I'm going to make to you, and where we want to look at, well, what is actually what are ways in which one can make this distinction? And one way of doing this is the degree, not just of granularity, but of structure, of formality of how things happen. I want to show you what I mean when I talk about things that structure cannot cover. And I want to do that with an example. And this is an example of my personal experience. So a few years ago, we moved house here. And I live in Basel in Switzerland, and both in my old apartment and the new apartment, we had this fiber to the home connection. So I have this fiber cable coming out of the wall, but in the new apartment, it went, I have now here, it's just in front of me, I have a big wardrobe coming just right in front of the box. So it has to be connected before the movers come and put the wardrobe there. And also it needs a longer cable than the one I had. So I went into the shop, bought a longer cable, and put it to the side, waiting for the move. Very fortunately, a few days before, I went to check this, and it turned out, since I'm not a a residential customer, I'm a small company, an SME customer to this phone provider. They have exactly the same router, with the only difference that the connector is of another standard. So there are two standards of this cable, and it wasn't the right one. Of course, the guy in the shop couldn't know it, because usually professional customers are served over the phone and not in the shops. I called, they sent another cable. That was all perfect. But now what happened is I had 200 boxes here in my apartment. Of course, it took more than a month until I went back into the shop to bring back the wrong cable, and then with the receipt, but more than 30 days have passed. So what you also need to know in this case is the company has, for its identity, and we're talking now here as a higher level of recursion, if you want, or you can even say, in terms of several systems, one encompassing, they have a very important rule. And they say, we are not the cheapest, but we want to earn our premium of price with a premium of service. And that means also that our employees have more license to give leeway to, in this case, for example, to accept the cable back, although the 30 days have passed. That is what we delegated as autonomy to our employees. And in this case, let's call them very small systems one. Now, what happened in that case is I came back, I had this cable, I told them the story, and the guy, the first thing that he did was he went to the computer, checked it, and said, "Ah, yes, your story is correct. You have actually moved the house." I was already a bit taken aback. Then he went into the back part of the shop, no idea what he did there. He came back and he said, "Okay, we are going to hand you back the money now, but we want to point out we are in no way obliged to do so. And next time you really have to come back in time, because we have to be very careful. We have way too many customers who try to trick us." Now, when you think about what the overall direction of the company is, let us win our price premium with the service premium, you can imagine that I felt, this was not really the way I wanted to be treated as a customer. I'm not a potential trickster here. I'm not a potential thief or something. So when we change now the perspective on the situation, we can ask ourselves, as a regional manager, if I have my systems that, observe what's going on, I am now talking about the system 3-star. In my system 3-star, what can I see? Did this employee, I heard there is a cable has been brought back and so on. Did this employee behave correctly according to the company direction? The answer would be yes. He took the cable back, although it was more than 30 days past, and I was fine. So the fact that what he told me during that interaction was absolutely not in line with company intent, cannot be recorded over this typical kind of, the reporting systems that you have. So the question is, how can you manage for alignment, for a better orientation of that kind of behavior, of that last mile, where it all depends on how the person actually interprets their rules and their obligations that they have, how the person talks to the customer. How can you manage for more alignment there without destroying the autonomy? Because you want the autonomy. You don't want to give them sentences to learn by heart and you must only talk in these sentences or something. No, they have to adapt to the individual situation. So how can you create more alignment there? And that is my core question here. So how to create in this last mile of execution, where it's no more structure that determines the behavior, how can you influence that behavior in a way without taking away the autonomy and also this kind of ownership and sense of responsibility that you want to have in employees when they do that? And by the way, this is an example from a customer front. You can do the same towards, I don't know, the sense of quality, the sense of, priority of speed or whatever you want. And so it can be also towards other topics here. How do you do that? I want to show you two examples where that has been done in various ways. And I want to show you also how this can be transformed into tools, into instruments that actually can be taught to leaders. So the first example is from Ritz-Carlton. The Ritz-Carlton, as you all know, 5-star hotel. And as you know, with structural elements like, I don't know, perfect processes, there are no mistakes, and a lot of money went into the infrastructure and so on. That's what all the 5-star hotels do. So you don't excel towards your competition by doing just that. That's kind of the baseline. How can you be better? Well, you can be better with the employee behavior. And employee behavior, let's not forget, we are still talking about quite low skilled and low paid people, doing, I don't know, working in the kitchen, cleaning the rooms and so on. How can you influence that behavior in a way that is organized across the whole chain of hotels? So it's not just the team leader who has this charisma or whatever and then influences that. I want to show you, I've taken these stories from across the web. I've done a lot of research on the web, and I've broken them down into certain elements, and they all play together. The first element here is an anchor. You need some kind of high level, high abstraction that shows some kind of direction. Some call it a North Star. It can be connected to the business model. It can be connected to the strategy. It can be connected to values. But it needs something that is an anchor from which you derive the sense making in individual situations. In this case, it takes the form of like a motto that they have. It's called, "We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen." Now, what does that mean? It means eye level, right? It's not this servile behavior, but it means we can afford a behavior on eye level between employees and our guests. What is also interesting is they do things to show that they are serious with that. This is not just words. So, for example, when in China, they bought another hotel and renovated the hotel, that's what usually they do when a chain takes over a hotel, keeping the same staff. The first thing they renovated was the staff entrance. Didn't cost a lot of money, but it showed we are serious about this thing. Another thing that happens when you're a new employee and you start at the Ritz-Carlton, somewhere during your onboarding phase, you spend a few nights as a guest at the Ritz-Carlton. So you finish your job in the kitchen, you go out, maybe you can take some time in the spa, you have a nice dinner in the restaurant, you sleep in that wonderful room, just in order to experience what it means to be a guest at the Ritz-Carlton. So they take that seriously. The next thing that happens now we have to go and become a bit more tangible, more concrete. In their case, this orientation, but it's already directed towards behavior. In their case, it's called the gold standards. They have 16 rules in the gold standard. And I just took out 3 of them. So one is, I build strong relationships and create Ritz-Carlton guests for life. That's very important because it fits to the situation. So we are not talking about generalize, things that you can generalize. It fits to the situation. Ritz-Carlton is a hotel chain. Guest for life, that means a certain value. They are actually talking about $250,000. So somebody, not maybe who's paid by the employer, or as in my case, once the client paid my stay at the Ritz-Carlton, but people who pay from their own pocket. If they stay for life, usually they spend around $250,000 during that time. So that's what you're aiming for. How to create loyalty so that whenever there's a Ritz-Carlton in town, people will actually go to the Ritz-Carlton. Then the next one, I'm empowered to create unique, memorable, and personal experiences for our guests. We will see what that means. So we are talking about this wow experience. We are talking about situations where the guests feel treated specially. I like very much the third one. I own and immediately resolve guest problems. That means if you see a problem, it's your problem. So you're the guy, carrying up the luggage to the room with some guests, and you see somebody else has put the breakfast tray in front of their door and has forgotten to announce that, and it's still there. It's your problem to get that tray away. Either you have time in a few seconds, you take a minute and then you're done and you carry down that tray. You're not house service. Yes, but it's your job now. Or otherwise you call them for a moment. So it translates into desired behavior, but still we're far away from the context, from the concrete situation. How can you now work towards making that real in concrete situations? Well, the third element here, you need a practice that shapes attention, that focuses attention on how can you make that happen. And what they do is they have a thing they call the lineup. And every shift starts with a lineup in the team. It takes about 10 minutes. And sometimes, it's kind of announcements and I don't know, birthdays and stuff like that. But 3 times a week, the lineup is dedicated to one of these gold standards. And they share good examples. So examples of exemplary, very good behavior according to these gold standards. What happens is that whenever such examples, and I will come to them in a minute, whenever such examples happen, then the managers are told to report them to communication. And 3 times a year, communication comes out with a long list. For every gold standard, there's a list of examples across the world. And in this lineup, every team gets this list, and the team member, it's not the head of the team, but the team member, they take turns, can choose an example that they want to discuss with the others in the team about a particular gold standard. Now, what does that create? It doesn't mean please copy paste this example. And that's the important bit about the contextuality of complex situations. The next situations that these people will face is not identical to the one in the examples. But if people have over and over discussed many examples, next time that they are standing in front of an unsolved situation, unsolved problems, they have an idea of what is a good example here. And that's what we're trying to achieve. Without being able to predict that, we want to influence the attention towards that direction. The last element that is needed here also means that the autonomy that people get has to be substantial. And we have to show that we mean it for them to use this autonomy. In the Ritz-Carlton case, this thing is called the $2,000 rule. What does that mean? It means that every Ritz-Carlton employee, down to the lowest level, has the permission to use up to $2,000 to solve a customer issue without asking for permission. It's their decision. Now, that doesn't mean that they constantly spend $2,000. They do a lot of things which don't cost anything, but they know that they are given the ownership of this situation. They know that it's not just on paper, but it's serious. Now, I want to give you some examples of what behavior ensues from that kind of context, from these 4 elements. One story is a customer was in a hotel room, and he called because a light bulb needed changing. So there was this mechanic changing the light bulb, and the customer said, "Oh, by the way, how long does it take to get to the airport? It could be that I'm a little late." And the mechanic turned around and says, "Fastest way to the airport? I drive you, sir." Drops his tools, goes down to the garage, takes a car, drives the customer to the airport. Another example, in Bali, there was the national holiday, Galungan, which means also the shops are closed, but all the employees could dress in traditional clothes. And some guests were interested. So there is this room attendant that tells them. And she said, so there was a mother and her daughter who were very interested in the fabric and so on and asked me about the dress. And then she said, I wanted to give them a dress as a gift. But the problem was I couldn't go to a shop because they were all closed today. So I remembered that a cousin in the family has just bought one dress which would probably fit the daughter. And so I phoned up the cousin, asked them to bring the dress over, told them they can buy one on the cost of the hotel the next day, and gave that to the guest. The decision of a room attendant to do that. Another example in Toronto, kids, 2 boys, were playing floor hockey in the hallway. And of course, you can't do that. There was another guest who complained. And they were told, the parents were told kindly, they can't do that. That's what every hotel would do. But the Ritz-Carlton, the people then said, you know what, we have a ballroom which is not used at the moment. Why don't you come down and have a match there? And they took some of the colleagues from the hotel, and with improvised tools, they challenged the family to a match of floor hockey. Of course, the story spread across the internet and everything. You know, that's exactly what they want to achieve. And the last example, that was in Berlin. Family left, little daughter, her teddy bear was forgotten. So the dear teddy bear of the daughter was forgotten. Now, most hotels, I have examples, not all, but most of hotels put that teddy bear in a box and send it back to the family. That's the kind of the usual business. But what they did in the Ritz-Carlton was they took pictures with the teddy bear in different places, as you can see in the kitchen, and the bar piano, and so on. And then they wrote a little story of the adventures that the teddy bear had during that day, and that it wasn't feeling lonely at all, and then sent it back together. So you can imagine that's what, 15, 20 minutes of work, and you create that unique moment. And still, I want to remind you, these are, you know, low-skilled, not super paid people who do that kind of behavior. Now, how can you do that outside? I've told you now this example of these different elements. How can you do that outside? I want to show you the key element. When you have something on the high level, the anchor, the translation of the anchor, the key element, the lineup. I have actually done that with several other companies as a tool, as a practice of people. And we were focusing not just on wow stories, we were focusing on stories where the people had conflicting interests, you know, cost versus quality, short-term versus long-term, and so on. And there was a diversity, a lack of alignment. And what we did was this simple 3-step thing. The head of the team would choose these cases, and they have to be controversial. And they have to be maybe from recent experiences, something that people can relate to. Otherwise, it's not worth discussing. And they generalize the case. They tell it, okay, you know, like my case before, a customer comes and hands back a cable, but it's over the 30 days. What do you do? And then you collect the diversity of answers around the table. And you don't start discussing until you have all the answers. And sometimes you have people who do it in written form so that, you know, they don't influence each other. And then you evaluate, and then you see, okay, which are examples of which we would like to see more, which are examples of which we would like to see less. And you see the careful formulation, because with that, we don't say, okay, let's come to a conclusion. The rule for everybody, always and everywhere, copy paste is this, because that would be the wrong approach. It's just evaluating good examples versus bad examples. And when people have done that 10, 12 times, the next time they're in front of a situation, their mindset and their focus is more towards the alignment, towards the direction that the company would like. How can we then work towards that from a top management perspective? I have some examples. Well, some examples I've collected, like Jürgen Dormann is famous for his Dormann letters. They were actually published as a book as well. He wrote a letter every Friday to the company, and they were usually not letters about, you know, our strategy is now blah, 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 some high level generic things. But it was stuff like, last week I went to the US, visited some customers, and this is what happened. So stories, but the stories over time repeated the same message. In his case, it was about strategy execution. The same with Urs Berger. I actually worked for him when he was the CEO of Valois. I did leadership training for Carsten Schlotter as a CEO of a Swisscom. They all worked in that way. And the other two are examples of customers of mine where we have systematically, in a way, started a top management blog in order to transport stories towards to work towards alignment. Now let's change the focus a bit, go away from these 4 anchors and so on, because I want to show you another example where, you know, structural decisions that take that go over a whole system, a whole company, can actually provide the context for these behavioral, these last mile elements, these unfathomable, uncapturable elements to be influential and to work again towards, well, in this case, not just towards alignment, but also to work towards decisions then that can roll out again through the whole system. And this example is Zara. I'm going to give you at the end of this, and we're coming to the end now, I'm going to give you a case that I've written up of this Zara, where you can see many, many things where the structure is used with intelligence in mind towards the complexity of the challenge. You can imagine Zara is fast fashion, you know, how to produce garments and have them in the market between design and them being in the shop within about 2 to 3 weeks. So how to be extremely fast and how to optimize towards that. Now, 2 things I want to point out here, because they connect to that, is one is that room that you can see. So Zara, in difference to their competitors, they have completely separated men's, women's, and children's fashion. At the level of market management, design, product management, and so on, they are not joined, but they are separate for ideas of variety, for reasons of variety here. So this is one, I don't know which one it is, but this is one of these teams. You have in this big room, you have all the designers, all the product managers, and all the heads of the markets together. Why? In order to increase osmotic communication, to increase the capability to overhear something that is going on over there and make connections. You can't predict when that happens. You can't plan it, you can structure that, but you open up the constraints here in order for, well, serendipity in a way to have a chance. And at the same time, what you do is you make sure that every branch has a call into every one of these 3 rooms per week. And in this call, I mean, you know, you have at the time now, you have real-time inventory surveillance and all these kind of things. So the numbers, the digital parts, they are there. But the rumors, the reasons, what people, for example, what they were looking for and couldn't find, why people did not buy, all these kind of things are stories. And by these phone calls, they're about 30 minutes phone calls, you can make sure that stories arrive here and that they are exchanged. Give an example of what happened here. One day, a woman walks into a shop, I don't remember where it was, and asks for a pink scarf, a big pink scarf. They didn't have pink scarves. But the shop manager mentioned it in the weekly phone call. It just happened to overhear them. And in that room, they found out, oh, there are actually 12 other examples where the shop manager mentioned women looking for pink scarves. Nobody has an idea why, but the decision is taken to have 500,000 pink scarves produced and shipped and put into the shops within a week, and within 3 days they're sold out. Still, nobody, probably some pop star had a pink scarf or something, I don't know. For some reason, there was an attention for pink scarves, a very short-lived demand for pink scarves, and they were able to react to that. Now, no systematic market research could give you that. But this way of creating channels which open up the constraints within these channels, there is no structure of what we talk about in these phone calls, what you find relevant, what you find important. This opening up of constraints is the secret sauce here. Okay. I hope I've given you some ideas, some insights of how you could make that connections towards the squiggly lines, towards this kind of last mile between structure and what you cannot structure, what is behavior and what you would like to influence in ways, but you cannot, you know, have this very kind of lever in your hand approach towards that. And now, yeah, we still have a lot of time. I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Bernhard. Really interesting and very inspiring your talk. So lots of really good examples and lots of things to think and learn. So, okay, let's open the conversation. We haven't got yet anybody in the chat asking questions. So, who would like to comment or participate in this conversation?
By the way, I'm just uploading the two PDFs here. One is the slides and the other is the Zara case.
Okay, thank you. Mark.
Hi, it was a great talk. Thank you. Something I've been quite curious about for a long time. I have two questions. One is, when you first started talking, I went to the place of what role fear and anxiety causes in the last mile, and that before you started giving examples, I was imagining, well, the main thing you'd want to do as a leader is create an environment that was less fearful, so people would be more creative and so forth. And then that led me to ask this question. So this will be the end of it, but is, so you presented examples where people wanted more choice at that level. What about institutions where they actually want less? You know, you've got, say, people operating a missile silo, and you really don't want them to have any choices. They're essentially human algorithms. So I just, because to me that would then allow us to test your theory in very extreme different situations. And I really enjoyed your talk, Bernhard. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can address both of them. So the first one was about the fear and anxiety. And I like that very much because you remember the quote from Stafford that I put in, where it's this thing about you know, the confidence. Don't destroy the confidence on the level of the operation. And I've learned, I think about 3 years ago, I've learned that English word sheeple, you know, sheep and people. And it has become one of my favorite in the meantime, because, you know, this idea of if you treat people long enough as if they were sheep, then you get sheep. I mean, or as Max Beerbohm once says, if you take a sheep and put it on their hind legs, you know, one sheep, then, you know, it doesn't compare to a person. But if you take a flock of sheep and put them all on their hind legs and compare them to a group of people, then, you know, maybe it becomes more difficult to see the difference. So what I mean by that, I think we have to be careful when elements of, you know, standards and procedures and workflow and so on produce a lack of ownership. I translate this confidence element in Stafford's quote with ownership. And I believe that, and I come to that for your second question, then in the condition that what we need and that the challenge we face is complexity. So we need, and what I mean by complexity, I mean two effects of complexity. One is that every case is different. So we have these unique situations that we have to deal with, the variety of unique situations. We cannot standardize them. And the other one is there is unpredictable things. So when we have these two elements as the challenge, then I believe that, you know, autonomy in this last mile is a very powerful tool. Because if you cannot afford autonomy for whatever reason, you have to write a procedure for every exception and exception and exception. Then your book of procedures gets 800 pages thick, and then nobody reads it anymore. You know, and go back and look why Chernobyl happened, and you find exactly that. So this one element of how can we make sure that people keep this ownership is central. If you have fear and anxiety, and the question is of what? Of not being able to deal with the situation, or of being punished for not dealing adequately. So what, you know, one is outside looking and the other is inside looking. But if you have this fear and anxiety, then I believe you can't just open up autonomy and then you don't get anything. You get weakness. You get lack of this ownership. And this connects to another element that is, I think, quite fashionable at the time, which is psychological safety. When you look, you know, concept of psychological safety, I think it goes down to the 90s or somewhere. It has been made a bit fashionable recently when about 2015 or so, there was this project in Google who tried this scientific approach to HR. We have a discussion about that as well. But anyway, the outcome is kind of, what they see as a key element of performing teams or high-performing teams is psychological safety, meaning a different thing than trust. Trust is one-to-one. This is the context. So the team lets me be vulnerable in front of the team, which is actually a condition to reduce vulnerability in the execution. And that connection, I think, is very important here. So how can we reduce, and I understand that I'm running against a current here. There is this desire, managers have been trained, to, okay, let's, standard operating procedures, and here we need to have it ISO certified, and here we have it. And so all these kind of things that delegate responsibility into a document, if you want. How can we give them the courage to reduce that? Because it's the condition for that, what I showed here, to work. If one person is being told off in this Ritz-Carlton example for using badly the $2,000, the whole thing will die. So this is the one thing not to do. And how many examples, I can only talk about my customers, I see them almost daily. Examples where somebody, mostly not by bad intention, but by not thinking, kind of creates exactly that signal. That people go back to the, sorry for the word, cover my ass behavior, and then we don't have that. And by the way, maybe something to point out there, Mark, there is, what's this book called? Managing the Unexpected, exactly. Yeah. Managing the Unexpected by Carl Weick and Kathleen Sutcliffe.
I read it.
They make this connection, and I haven't made it just right now, but just thinking about your question, I came up. When you look at what's happening in the airplane carriers and so on, it's exactly working on not. Yes, we have procedures. Yes, we have some things that we can rule with structure, and we can create safety. But then it's also managing that other side.
Let me say this. I unfortunately have to go at the hour, and I've already taken up too much time. But in the world I work in, the stuff you talk about is really relevant. But for me, the last mile is the person with the model, whose model is their lived experience. So I work in neighborhoods, and I like to say, give me 5 mothers and I can change the world, at least change the neighborhood, because their mental model isn't abstracted. It literally has the actual street light, the actual damage that happened to their child in school the previous day. And so I always like to get down the last mile. I put it in my blog. I'm going to use that term. I really like it. At least for technical people, it allows them to get down. And for the last mile, the model is the lived experience, not the abstracted one in my world. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I think you can create this abstract, maybe if you use Max Poiso's I-space, you can say maybe it is abstract, but it's not codified. It's not explicit. It's a kind of, and when what I see with teaching this is people don't have only to develop their model, they have to learn the practice or practice, if you want, the practice of deriving from the abstract model to the individual situation. That is a capability that needs to be developed. To your second question about where less, well, I've already answered it. So, when there is unexpected things and unique things, then more. But when you cannot afford that or can afford to ignore that, then less.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bernhard, for your presentation. It's very interesting that you put the focus in the last, you call it the last mile, in the person. At the end, within the viable system model, the final issue is the person that is inhabiting all those functions, all those relations, and that's the key. So in relation to this point, I have I would say a ratification of agreement because when you talk about the autonomy, and if we use the trust, if we succeed in getting trust in the employees, in the persons, in the organization, that they have trust, they trust their management, they trust their bosses, they trust the company, then we have huge amplifiers, huge amplifiers.
Yes.
And then the autonomy goes hand with hand with the trust. You provide them, because you trust them, you provide them autonomy. So if you have $2,000, as you said, and you quantify the level of autonomy, you said in the example, no? That's even better, no? Because it's a way of proving that you trust them. And the opposite works exactly as the opposite. The lack of trust is a disaster, is a destroyer of variety and a destroyer of efficiency, because you have to invest time to monitor the employees to see if they are doing the right thing. But when they perceive, it's a feedback loop, when they perceive that they are not trusted, they don't trust you, and they respond with an aggressive attitude, not cooperative. It's just a counter behavior. So in general, the only thing I can say is that I absolutely agree with your focus on this last element, and it's an element that is quite difficult to deal. The other two things I wish to do is just a couple of comments. One comment is, you mentioned at the beginning that you are very happy because you don't see backgrounds in the images of us. If I understood correctly.
No. I said I see several bookshelves.
Okay.
And sometimes, in other calls I'm in, you also see bookshelves, and they are artificial backgrounds, these Zoom backgrounds that you can put in.
And you see
their real life backgrounds.
So I understood it correctly. So you mean that you like that you see the real world, not an artificial world, providing an artificial image of the person that you are. So it's very interesting, that observation. From now on, I will not use backgrounds, artificial backgrounds. I will go back to my natural backgrounds with all the disorder that I have. I will show it. So because that is me. So the other point I would like to comment is that you mentioned Sarah. I'm very happy that you put this example, because where I am now physically, it's my city, it's La Coruña. I am now at 1 kilometer distance physically from where Rosalía Mera, the wife of Amancio Ortega, was living. It's just 1 kilometer away from my house. And if I go 2 kilometers in the other direction, is the first shop that Zara had ever. That is 2 kilometers away. So
that's wonderful.
I am in the core of Zara. And this image, this building that you're showing in the image is something like 7 kilometers away. That is where Zara has all the headquarters, which are millions of square meters of offices. It's huge. It's really a huge installation in this small city in the corner of the southwest of Europe. We are in the corner where the Atlantic is so heavy. We have storms, isolated, just in the northwest corner of Spain. In the past, we have not good communications. It was something like Wales in England, I suppose, or the Highlands in Scotland. This is like that. It's a corner of the universe. And here in the corner of the universe, in the more decrepit sector of production, that is the textile. I have been manager in the textile industry for 15 years. So I know that industry. I'm an industry engineer, so I know that and it's a very tough sector. No? And to be able to go from nothing to the position that he has, that's incredible. In a sector that is not biotechnology, pharmaceuticals. No, it's a very normal and very traditional sector. So this is something very interesting to see. So your observation is quite pertinent because it's one of the keys of the success that he has.
You will like the case study, because
exactly.
I point out other elements as well, which I think there is a lot of intelligence in the design.
So I thank you very much, because you are making reference to somehow to my city. And the last question, you mentioned anthropology, that you studied anthropology. I'm very curious, anthropology, if I understood correctly, anthropology.
when I started studying, it was called cultural history. When I ended, it was called historical anthropology. There was a change of fashion, I believe.
Yeah, the thing is, the question is, if you can answer, what is the relation that you did find between the anthropology and the systems theory, and being more concrete with the organizational cybernetics? Because I see that anthropology, if we go from the functionalists, Malinowski, Franz Boas, Durkheim, Marcel Mauss, Levi-Strauss, that was a structuralist, and the last funny guy, Marvin Harris in the United States. So all this bunch of thinkers about the complexity of the organization of the human being, that is the anthropology that deals with that. I say, for a person that has been involved in both fields, what is the relation that you find between anthropology and the system theory and the organizational cybernetics?
Yeah, I think, well, so I need to make a short answer. The long answer would be what the other talk that I proposed to Metaphorum. Maybe we're going to have it somewhere in the future. Because I believe what is very interesting is if you look at what are the paradigms of the theory of knowledge, of science, nomethetical science versus ideographical humanities. And what you find is that often in science, this difference is not reflected, because in science, some of the most fundamental claims that define your focus of interest is common across all science. For example, you're not interested in the individual, you're always interested in the type. You know, this idea of repeatability on the same conditions and so on. So that is, you can choose to look at it, at the world like that or not. In humanities, you don't have that commonality. So every person, every book needs to first argue their focus so that it can be just, you know, they can basically be judged on the execution of their claim. But nobody can say, you have a wrong claim. Well, no, you have a claim that I'm not interested in. That's okay. But so then you argue in a different way. Now, where that comes together is in complexity, you have such things as path dependency and contextuality. Mm-hmm. Which means that the part of one complex system that where science can be helpful because it describes things that all the complex systems have in common, is smaller in comparison to the part where it's that one and not another one, you know, and you can see how it translates. I mean, all these managers who are looking for benchmarks in culture, you know, why do you want to benchmark something which is so unique to your own condition? So that would be kind of the path in which it goes. I believe that there is a lack of conversation about what you can use from each other's methods between science and the humanity. And I believe exactly when it's about complexity, such a conversation could be helpful.
Okay, thank you, Bernhard.
But maybe we're going to have another talk about that.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Jose and Bernhard. Very interesting conversation. I think that really we may need to come back to this later in the future because it is really a huge field to explore. I myself have been doing very, very preliminary incursions in the field of trying to use BSM in the social context. And I ended up doing it with anthropologists. Yeah. So
yeah. I mean, just to give examples, you know, when I look at some of the complexity science books, they are showing things with examples of balls and how they form depending on what, and they are now up to, I don't know what, 62 balls. And I wrote a PhD about the relation between reputation, social norms, and the forming of public opinion and conformity pressure and the impact on elites. Yeah. So I don't have that detailed kind of granularity, but on a higher, level of recursion, you could say, you know, there is a way of arguing. And because science want to build from the single grain, then maybe they don't get there. And if we could connect the two of them, that would be wonderful.
We have a comment from Hugh.
Goes under.
Yeah, let me just get my hand down again. Lower hand. Great. Okay. So I had some thoughts and responses that I think tie in with what you were talking about more towards the end in your last conversation. So that might be helpful. So you're making distinctions between structure and behavior, and you're also making or aligning certain aspects, the squiggly lines, with behavior. Now, the way I've generally come at these things is just thinking about process. And for me, structure and behavior are very much the same thing, except perhaps you can, in the way that a way I understand that you're applying these is that you have a distinction of, to say coarsely, level. There's a level distinction. So it seems, yeah, granularity or level. Well, so for example, the structures that are imposed upon behaviors that either enable or constrain behaviors. So you're talking about this $2,000 freedom to spend $2,000. I would see that as perhaps a system 2 function, or at least system 2 having a lot of constraints, or a lot of control in that. So you're talking about the coordination between different systems. One, okay. But when you think about, well, who created that system 2, that in itself is a behavior. Okay. So I see that the structure and the behavior just interplay with each other. Yes. If from the way that I come at these things. An example I was thinking of that perhaps could relate to the system, to this sort of system 2 view of this $2,000 generosity, is for, I'm going from recollection here, but I think in the UK, okay, for your speeding regulations, I believe that legally you are permitted to exceed the speed limit under particular conditions, for example, to get yourself out of danger. So if you were on the motorway and there was some hazard up ahead, but you need to accelerate in order to get out of this situation, you see, then that would be mitigating circumstances. I think that's the case, or at least certainly I wouldn't be worried about executing that if there was actual hazard there, right? Now, that for me is an example, for example, now, because as an example for system 2, the whole business of all the legislation and all the things you have to comply in order to be a valid driver are quite clear. And this might be, a way in to think about, oh yes, so that's an example of a system 2 everyone who's a driver can be aware of. But this comes back to my point of view about the viable in viable systems model, okay, is that what essentially it seems to me you're really talking about is not, for me, it's not something additional. You're saying, how do we actually make it viable, right? Because if you have, as you in your phrase, if you say your organization is full of sheeple, right, then you're going to struggle with viability. Mm-hmm. So to really get into viability, you need autonomy. And if you haven't got autonomy within your recursions, then you're not going to have the viability. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not necessarily making new points, but perhaps tying things together for you in that respect. Now, where you talk about differences between social science and conventional, whether you're going to call it positivist science or whatever. So I consider myself as bridging that that position, and again with a process model. So in the social aspects of psychology, the units that I have taken have been behavioral or activity. So I've taken units of activity in the studies that I performed within psychological development. And again, I believe I'm bridging those 2 points. But where you talk about a distinction, I think your distinction there was between emergent behavior or one-off behavior and types. And the distinction you can make there, or the distinction I make there, is for example, in terms of guidance. So you can have guiding schema at the appropriate level, which can be looked at as types, okay, which can guide the behavior itself, which can be always individual. So that's me. Hopefully interesting.
Thank you. Well, maybe I think to that last one, I think we have to make a difference between when we are talking about observed systems or managed systems. And the context where I'm going back, because I really have the impression we have to make a talk out of this here, just to give you that context, is the theory of science of the Southwest German school of neo-Kantianism. That's Max Weber, Rickert, and Windelband. So that's kind of early in the 1900s, where that distinction between what they called the natural science and the cultural science is different. The difference is really this idea of the individual, so the purely contextual. So a biography of Nelson Mandela could not be interesting to a scientist, only Nelson Mandela as an example of whatever, a leader or somebody in prison or whatever. But Nelson Mandela as Nelson Mandela, not example of any type here, just to capture that individual is a purely humanities perspective,
Right, but
not a scientific perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I focus on activity rather than individual, because the individual itself could be questioned, because your behavior can be very different in different contexts.
Sure. Yeah, that's in a lower level of recursion. Yeah. Now, to what you said about the structure and behavior, yes, of course they are. Well, to me, so structure and behavior are two main perspectives, or two lenses, if you want to look at reality. And in the beginning, what I showed was kind of these were people trying to create a whole theory of society based on either behavior as the core or structure as the core. But if you look at the connection now in the viable system model, so in a way, I like what you said about the viable. Without the last mile, no system can be viable. What I described before as the last mile. And the last mile can be, intelligent, helpful, or it can be not so helpful, not so intelligent. And that's where the idea is: how can we influence that to make the difference between better and worse? Now, what I think is, and that also ties into this element of the incomplete contract, is the part that is not captured by the incomplete contract. Now, what is the difference, I believe, in structure is that structure can be more easily codified, abstracted, and scaled. So if you use behavior to influence behavior, we are talking about, a leader by example. We are talking about what happens in a conversation, what happens by colleagues working next to each other and looking at each other. So the idea, especially the element of scalability, is not the same as when you design a process and then you photocopy it throughout a whole organization. And I think this element of being able to be codified, abstracted, and as a consequence designed and scaled is important.
Thank you very much, Hugh and Bernhard. John has a couple of questions.
Yeah, so thank you. That was really great talk, Bernhard. Really enjoyed it. And I think what it does for me is to show just how Stafford's ideas become more and more relevant every day, and the way that we run things and the way we organize things is changing, and I think we're catching up with him finally. The points I want to make is that all your stories, which I love, and particularly the one about the Ritz-Carlton, reminds me of a company in California called Smith & Hawken, which was set up by a guy called Paul Hawken. And he set up his company on the basis that his customer care wouldn't be good, it wouldn't be great, it would be legendary. And for me, that was quite a revelation, because the sort of thing he did was that if customers bought, you sell things like spades and forks, and somebody bought a garden bench, and they wrote to him and they said, the garden bench has come, thank you very much, but by the way, there was one screw missing. And what he did was, rather than stick a screw in an envelope and send it to him, he hired a carpenter from the nearest town, which was 50 miles away, and this guy drove over, put the screw in. And of course, this is just brilliant marketing. I mean, it's really wonderful. But what I see, the way I'd see that is about a very, very clear System 5 that you want to be legendary in your customer care, like the Ritz-Carlton. And all your stories for me are beautiful examples of how that System 5 is rippled through the whole system, so everybody at all levels understands it. And I would see that as a VSM interpretation of that story. The Zara story about the pink scarf, I would interpret as information coming on the horizontal axis from a customer into one of the lower levels of recursion, being recognized by a System 4 in that viable system at the lower recursion, and the connection between the System 4s right the way up through the recursions to the higher levels where it was relevant. And so I'd see that as a thing about horizontal information becoming System 4 information and moving up, and the links upward through the system, which of course is fundamental to VSM philosophy, but very, very different to the way hierarchies work, where information flows down very well but doesn't flow up. So once again, VSM interpretations. So what I was thinking was that most of the information you're giving for me is more to do with the horizontal linkages between the lower levels of recursion and the outside world. So I wondered where the squiggly lines fit into it.
Exactly there.
But the squiggly lines go from operation to operation, not from operation to the outside world.
No, but informed by the experience that the operation has of the outside world. Because the squiggly, at least, please correct me, I'm sure I'm not the best expert in the room here on the VSM, but the way I understand the squiggly lines, the most important reason or what they do in terms of the goods that they create is in dealing with the overlaps in the relevant environments of the different systems one. And the second one is in concern of the system 2.
Okay, I think
sources and so on. But the most important is this outside focus.
Okay,
John has here something to add to that discussion.
Yeah, I think for me this is we're looking at the 6 vertical channels, of which the link between the operational bits are one of them. So
no. It's informed by what you see in the overlaps. You have to coordinate with the other system 1.
Okay.
That's where it goes to the other system 1. So in my case, alignment, of course, is not a direct person-to-person coordination. It's just how can we, through a higher level of recursion, make sure that all these people behave in a coordinated way and create a unit of an identity of, for example, user experience towards the customer. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's fine.
I want to add some other things, but I see a hand up there. I think it's connected to what we are just talking about right now.
Well, we have Elena with the hand raised.
Yeah, no, but John as well.
Oh, well, John.
No,
I'm not connected to that.
Okay, so maybe if I can still add to that for a moment, the thing about System 5.
Can I speak to that?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So the purpose of an organization is so that many people can work together, assuming other people are doing other things so they can focus on what they're doing and they can collaborate. The problem with scientists is you take the model and you think the model is reality. Yeah. Nobody working is seeing the squiggly lines. Nobody is working is saying they know what the hierarchy is, but the janitor walks past the CEO. If the CEO is smart, he will say hello to the janitor. When you have cross communication within your structure, then the squiggly lines work. The problem is that with experience, you take the Old Testament, which was believe in God or be a Jew, and it became the 800-page Old Testament and nobody could do it. And then Jesus came with a new message. But that's what we do, is we create a whole new structure that realizes that the reality has changed. This is Stafford's basic message. If you look at your kid, he's changed. She's changed since the last time you talked to him. Find out how the world is now. When you're in the operating system, when two people are working together, 99% of their communication is nonverbal. Most of it is based on their past behavior and their expected behavior, and they continue their routine. When they deviate from their routine, either they're adapting or they're being bad. If they're adapting, it's because they're autonomous. What Stafford and John Walker and his guide do is drive down the decision making, so you maximize the likelihood that the people that are making the decisions are the people that have maximum information about what's actually going on in the moment. And you don't let the procedures and your past experience stop you from seeing what's actually going on. Thank you.
I like that. I just get, it's kind of, if the 10 commandments were given us at the time of the laser printer instead of the stone slab, we would be doomed. If there were the 2,000
There's got to be
commandments.
congruence between the system and the real world. When the real world changes, you have incongruence. Then you ultimately have paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Nature bats last. There is no way that we are going to survive the technology of the 20th century much longer.
Yeah.
Either it's going to kill us, or we're going to adapt and become more compatible with nature so that we don't have so much pollution. We are killing ourselves. We are killing our version of anthropology. That's my other point. As an anthropologist, you're still seeing people. The problem with engineers, and I started out in engineering and ended up in economics, which is kind of a bad compromise. But the problem with engineers is you lose sight of the people and see them as secondary to the machine.
You define them as on the other side of the system boundaries, and that's a problem.
One last thing. E.F. Schumacher said the difference between a machine and a tool. A machine is something that dominates human life. A tool is something that the human has control of. Thank you.
Thank you. To come back, before we take time for Lennon in a moment, but to come back to what John said, two things here. I think this idea of the system for passing up information is, it did that so not knowing the definite or the value that this information had about the King's calf, right? So an organization to me is always, somewhere I read this wonderful quotation, what people need to know in order to do their job should be at human scale. So how can people make good contributions without everybody understanding everything about everybody else in the organization? And so this idea of people, on the off chance that this pink scarf information could be relevant, but I don't know it, I decide to put it into the call, and then something can happen or it doesn't. So that, an engineer would have a lot of problem with that kind of, what, so much uncertainty. But yes, exactly. The other thing, you mentioned system 5, and I think there is also a risk, a danger in that, especially when you look at things like new, agile, for example, at the moment. And that's the danger that I believe any organization that has some kind of purpose is therefore by definition pragmatic in nature. Pragmatic as to opposed to normative, and that's where it becomes very interesting. When you think about, as a small child, we learned not to touch the hot stove. Some of us because we burned our fingers, most of us because mommy told us so. And now something happens. Did we not touch the stove because mommy had the reasoning that it was hot and therefore, that's a good reasoning and we trust that it's correct and therefore we do it in order to avoid getting burned consciously? Or do we not touch the stove in order to avoid getting scolded by mommy? So what we do is, by fixing on the source of the normative, we go away from where the object reason actually was, why it makes pragmatically sense. And there's that risk. How do you do a system 5 activity, which I believe is absolutely necessary, in a way that still doesn't take away the focus from the pragmatic where it makes sense. Open question. Anyway, Elena.
Yes, Elena.
I wanted to ask about the role of transparency in all of this, because it seems that the good examples that you gave were very transparent organizations, but not all organizations are very transparent, and some are actually very opaque.
Yeah.
And I just wondered how big a part transparency played in that.
I always have a problem with transparency. I once had a client who told me that he had these discussions like, yeah, we need more transparency in the team. We need more transparency. He said, okay, so everybody who wants more transparency, I will copy you in all emails that I get, and all emails that I send, you will have full transparency. And of course, nobody wants that. We have information overflow. We never want transparency. When we say we want transparency, we want relevance. We want a more open relevance filter. But we want the filter nonetheless. Now, to come back what you say, yes, there are. So if you have like a culture, or from whatever reasons, you have a not so disclosing organization, then many of these things cannot happen. And I find that's a problem, and that's probably limiting to them. I think about banks, in Switzerland, we have banks. I happen to have them as customer every now and then. I think they sometimes struggle with the fact that they have, and by the way, that's culture contaminating. There are reasons in very enclosed things about, customer data, that they have to be very intransparent, and it becomes part of their second nature. And then they are also being intransparent in internal stuff where they shouldn't. Mm-hmm. And again, the pragmatic goes away. And I find that problematic. And yes, so at the level of transparency is necessary. But when you look at then what these processes that I described do, is actually they align focus. Mm-hmm. So, it's like in traffic. We have some experiments with zones where it's 20 kilometers an hour max, and it's kind of no rules. So, the rule is the weakest have precedence, probably. But is it left? Is it right? Is it no rules? Now, what happens there is people slow down, and their attention goes up to anything that could happen. They probably also notice that there are, dead leaves on the ground, and think which are not relevant, just because the attention goes up. And what we did with this thing about what examples do you choose, or my examples of people that I coach writing blogs. What do you write in your blogs? What is the undercurrent that across these various examples that you tell is again and again pointed out? That is where you want to increase focus. So, for example, with one company, that's interesting. I increase focus on focus. There is a company that kind of, they try to do everything, and they have a problem with that. And so, one training that we try to convey with these blogs is it is worth focusing, and it's worth deciding what not to do, and it is worth prioritizing, and it's worth thinking about where you spend your time, what's the most worthwhile use of yourself as a resource, and so on. So these are all various examples, and they all go into the same direction. And what they do is they increase that focus, probably on the detriment of others, but they increase that focus. So transparency, or the being capable, or the potential of transparency is a prerequisite for that to work. But once we have that, we don't want everything, but we want focus. So where do we put our spotlight is kind of where the practice goes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. But that is, when I was thinking about transparency, I wasn't thinking about the level of sharing every email. I was thinking about the level of being very clear about what the norms and values and boundaries are, so that people can do their jobs without having to guess.
Yeah, that reminds me of a customer I once had where I did a team leader training, and during that time, I think 30 of the most important managers of the company were away for 3 months in a row for the strategy. So all the strategy work was done in an offsite. You can imagine also what it means when you take away all these key people. And they came back, and they had kind of a one-slide summary, which said nothing really. And everything else about the strategy was kept a secret, because if you communicate that to everybody, then it will leak out to the competition. We can't afford that. Honestly, the impact of that strategy was highly doubtful, because of, yes, these people then decided on some, key performance indicators and projects and stuff, but everybody else had no clue why this was happening. There was no sense making around that. And of course it didn't work.
Mhm.
So to me, that goes into the same category. That's what you're describing as transparency is a prerequisite for, not just for what I described to happen and to be, that you can use that, but also for a viable company to work.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Bernhard. I think we're just in time to finish. I can see a comment from Brian, but I guess it's just a comment. Is it, Brian, or do you want to do a final question? Well, doesn't seem to be there. So anyway, well, let's call this an end to the webinar. Really interesting, very, very nice and interesting examples and theory. And thank you for sharing with us. We should
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much. Well done. Okay, so we will upload the presentation and the recording in the Metaphorum. And we'll hope to see you in 2 weeks with Marcus. Marcus Schwaninger will be leading the webinar in 2 weeks. He will be starting the second series in this year. And I will announce very shortly the next few months webinars after, include Marcus and after Marcus. Okay? So thank you very much. See you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
And
What this was.